Hey everyone, it's Colt. Today we're talking about Flexbox, and I've got to say I'm pretty happy with how this video turned out. Speaking of being happy, yesterday I hit 100,000 subscribers on YouTube, which is amazing. It's great to see this community grow, to see new faces, and to celebrate, I'm giving all of my YouTube subscribers a $500 scholarship to my software engineering bootcamp. It's a self-paced online bootcamp. You can take it at home from the comfort and safety of your own sofa, and it comes with a job guarantee. So if you're interested in learning to code and getting a software engineering job without any risk, you can offload all that risk onto me. If you don't get a job, you get your money back. So take a look at the link in the description. There's also information about the scholarship, the $500, and how you can redeem that. Speaking of the description, there's also links to, or a single link to a folder of code pens, and that includes all of the exercises and challenges, the solutions, and the code from this video. Speaking of the exercises, I definitely recommend that you do them. This is a long video because we have a lot to cover. And the exercises are there for two main reasons. One, to break up the content so you don't get too bored, but two, to help you understand some of these concepts. So take a look in the description at both of those things. And I think that's enough chit chat at the beginning. Thanks again for helping me hit 100,000 subscribers, and let's talk about Flexbox. Here we go. So let's begin with the obvious upfront question. What is Flexbox? Flexbox is just a nice way of laying out elements inside of some container, some box. So we can lay them out, we can align them, distribute space between the items or center items, move them to the left, to the right. Flexbox is a model for laying out content within a given box. So imagine that we have some container on our page. Maybe it's a section with 3 images in it. Each image is represented by one of these little colored squares. So there are so many different ways to arrange those items within this container. We could put them all on the left, equally sized, and any additional space will be on the right-hand side. We could do the opposite, push them all to the right and have the space on the left. We could distribute the space between the images, or I could grow the middle image and have it take up more space. So have the left and the right ones be squares or be some size, and then the middle one will just grow to take up whatever is left, so there is no gap anymore. Or I could do something like this, where I have the first image way, way larger and the other two are equally sized and small. I could go vertical. I could take that container and totally switch it up and make it into a column instead of a row, and then do the exact same thing. How do I split up the space vertically? Do they all grow to be 1/3? Do they stay a square and then we split the space between them? All of these layouts and many, many more are easily achievable using Flexbox. Now, you do have to understand some of the terminology around Flexbox. There are quite a few property names. I still mix them up all the time. It's just one of the downsides of Flexbox, in my opinion, is that some of the property names are not that intuitive. So I want to give you a couple of examples of what you can do with Flexbox. Here's an example from a web page I found online where we've got this layout. We've got one big box here, if you can imagine. We don't see it, but there's a box all of this content is inside of. And then it's split up into a couple different boxes, 1, 2, and then this third box is actually divvied up vertically into space inside that box. So we have nested boxes where we're laying out some content and distributing space. Here's another example. We've got, 5? No, I can't add at all. How did I think that was 5? We've got 7 images, and 3 of them go across here, and then 4 of them go across down here. Same idea here. We've got 3 pieces of content, 1, 2, 3. And then within each one of those boxes, we have a vertical column with 3 elements inside. And then within each one of those elements, we've got content on the left and on the right. So by the end of this video, you'll understand how to make layouts similar to this, or to this here, or to this. I really like this web page. This is a developer's blog. We've got this middle content that contains all the blog posts, and it alternates between a post going all the way across and then 50-50, and then all the way across 50-50, and so on. And it just so happens that some of the posts are about Flexbox. So let's begin now with actually learning how we use Flexbox. I did mention that there are quite a few properties, and their naming is not always that intuitive. I'll tell you the 2 I get tripped up on all the time once we get there. There are 2 groups of properties. There are container properties and then flex item properties. We're going to ignore the right-hand side for now and just talk about the left, container properties. So in order to use Flexbox, we have some container element that we will turn into that flexible box, into a flex box. Basically, we have some space that we want to divvy up. So here, if there's a box around this entire thing, which there is, we could say that is our Flexbox. And then within that, we can now use Flexbox Properties. And I can divide the space. Or with this example here, there's a box around this, a div or a section or something, that is set to be a Flexbox. So to help visualize all this Flexbox craziness, I have a code pen with a bunch of colored divs, just different background colors. You can find the link in the description if you'd like to follow along. Anyway, so we've got, 9 different boxes. They all have the exact same font size, just different background colors. Okay, so right now, no Flexbox involved whatsoever. And they're all inside of a section here. And this section is going to be my box that I'm going to turn into a Flexbox so I can manipulate this content. So replace this in your mind with images or, pieces of text or buttons or links in a nav bar, whatever the content is that we want to move around within a given box. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to start with this first piece of magic, which is to make my container a Flexbox. I need to set the display property to flex. So I'm going to select my class of container, just the section right there, and then I'm going to set display to be flex. And wow, quite the difference, right? All of a sudden, I have 9 boxes, all of them in a row, way smaller than before. So I'm going to begin by giving this section a border that we can see. How about, 8 pixels solid black, just so you can see where the container is. So it goes all the way over there. And if I get rid of that display flex, each one of these elements is a block level element. It takes up the entire width of this parent of the container, and they end up stacking and taking up a whole bunch of space, but display flex totally changes that behavior. Now, if I give my container a height, let's see what happens if I give it a height of maybe 80% of the viewport height. Check it out. They stretch to grow vertically. That's definitely a little bit different than normal without Flexbox. Okay, so display flex is how you turn a box into a Flexbox. It changes how that box works, how things are moved around and positioned inside of that container. So we have, just to reiterate here, those container properties. One of them is setting display to flex. Then we have the flex item properties that we apply to the individual boxes or whatever we're styling. Okay, so we do have some terminology. This is the stuff I'm not such a big fan of with Flexbox. In any Flexbox, in any container, which we'll just call a flex container, there are 2 axes that we need to label. There is the main axis and the cross axis. And I have to talk about these in order to explain some upcoming properties. So there's a direction that our content flows in. The main axis, by default, is from left to right. I have them numbered here, right? And we can see they're going from left to right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, based off of the order that I wrote them in inside of this container. So the main axis is this horizontal left to right now at least. And then we have the cross axis, which is just going to be perpendicular, and in our case, it's top to bottom. So if I had enough content that overflowed this, and the content ended up wrapping, it would wrap underneath. But we can change things using flex direction. Flex direction is a property that we put on the container, and it's going to define the main axis and its direction. So the default is flex direction of row. This is what we already have happening. Our content is flowing in a row from left to right, but if I change this to row reverse, let's try it on the container, flex direction row dash reverse. All of a sudden, the content is on the complete other side and in a different order. The content is flowing from right to left. We change the direction of that main axis. Now we're going from right to left. Whatever we have first is going to be on the far right, and then second, third, and so on. That's why I have them numbered. It's easier to see the order. But the cross axis, which is this perpendicular line, is still going from top to bottom. This will be important when we talk about wrapping. If we have content that doesn't fit, how does it wrap? So we also can change everything into a column. We can very easily say, actually, this is not a row anymore. I want this to be a column layout. And I'll just show you if I go back to row, which is the default, we don't notice any difference. That is the default direction. So if I make it a column layout, now our main axis goes from top to bottom, and our content is stacked in a column. And you can see we're actually overflowing that container. It stops right there, but right now these have a height set on them based off of the, well, it's I guess an implicit height based off of the font size, and they are overflowing. Now we'll learn how to handle that in a bit. So the main axis now, when we have direction of column, is top to bottom. And just like with row, we have flex direction column reverse, where we can reverse that direction from bottom to top. Column dash reverse. And now we start at the bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then go upwards. If you're following my free YouTube course on this, on CSS and learning to code, I have not covered responsive design yet, but I was waiting to cover Flexbox. You can very easily make a layout that starts as a row of images, and then on a small screen collapses to a column. Okay, so that's flex direction. We have 4 values that we've talked about. Row, which is the default, row reverse, column, and column reverse. We're setting the direction of the main axis. Now let's talk about flexwrap. Flexwrap controls whether the elements in a flex box or a flex container are forced onto a single line or if they can be wrapped into multiple lines. So to make this a bit easier to understand, I'm just going to go back to row, which is the default, and I'm going to give my elements a much larger size. I'm going to hard code them at 300 pixels each box for now. So width 300 pixels. And these are not 300 pixels. I can tell you that much right now. They are squeezing into this box, but they are not actually 300 pixels. What if I made them 500 pixels? Nothing changes. They're still the exact same size. So they're sucking in and holding their stomach in so they can fit into a tight pair of pants, but they're not actually 500 pixels. But if I change this one property on the container, flexwrap, and I set it to wrap, all of a sudden, my content is going to wrap over to the next line. So let's try it again, but this time we'll set flexwrap to wrap. Now take a look at what's happening here. So we go from left to right still, that's our main axis, but then we overflow, we can't fit 500 pixels there, so the content wraps to the next line, and the same process repeats. So if I change this to be 300 pixels, we still won't be able to fit, and we wrap over to the next line. Now remember those 2 axes we talked about, the main axis by default with row left to right, and the cross axis is top to bottom. So the content is going from left to right, and then when it wraps over to the next line, it's top to bottom, cross axis, so the next line starts below. But we can change that by changing flexwrap to be wrap-reverse as its value. And now it's going to alter the direction of the cross axis. The terminology is not crucial, that you're probably not going to be talking about main axis and cross axis with a whole lot of people. Just remember there are 2 axes and you need to be able to control both of them. And the way we control the direction of the cross axis is with flexwrap. So if I set it to wrap reverse, now we still go from left to right. That's our main axis. But now the cross axis goes from bottom to top. So our content wraps upwards. Now if I go back to just regular old wrap and I change direction to be column, now our content is top to bottom, that's the main axis, and the cross axis is left to right. Now don't worry about this spacing, this is something we'll cover later on, but each one of these is still 300 pixels wide, so that hasn't changed, but there's a whole lot of extra space now because they're not in a row, they're in a column. Now if I change this to wrap reverse, we're still going to go from top to bottom as our main axis, but notice how the cross axis has totally reversed. It's now from right to left. Anyway, those are 2 very important properties, flex direction and flex wrap. We use them to control these 2 axes, main axis and cross axis. Okay, super quick exercise time. If you'd like to do this, recreate the layout you see in front of you with the exact same boxes. A couple things have changed. First of all, notice that there are 3 elements per line. That is not done with Flexbox. I'm just setting the width property so that they're each a third. But then pay attention to the order. What's the main axis and what is the cross axis? Using the properties we've covered so far, how could you make this work or how would you make this happen? And here's the answer. It's just 2 properties, flex direction, row reverse, so that we are going from right to left as our main axis. And then we need to set flexwrap to wrap. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Also, I set the width to be 33.333333% instead of hard coding it as a number of pixels so that I could have them fit 3 on a line, whatever the size is. So now we get to one of the most useful properties, justify content. Another property name that I'm not crazy about, but it is one we use all the time. And the goal, the responsibility of justify content is to define how that space is distributed between the items in your Flex container along the main axis. I know it's a mouthful. So let's go back to a row Flex direction, and we'll just go with regular wrap. So our main axis, ask yourself right now, what is the main axis if you were to draw it mentally? And what is the cross axis? Which way do they go? Main goes from left to right, and cross axis is from top to bottom. Anyway, we've got a little bit of extra space. First on this row here, we've got extra space, right? And on this row here, we've got also a bunch of extra space. Justify content allows me to allocate that extra space on the main axis. So I'm going to do justify content. And the first option I'll show you is flex end. So let's do that now. Flex end. And all of a sudden, my content moves over to the right side, which is the end of my main axis. My main axis starts here and it goes to the right. So the order did not change. This might seem like it's the same thing as what we had when I did row reverse, but it's not. Here, our content started here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. But if I go back to just row, but I justify content flex end, it's still the correct order, 1, 2, 3, and so on, but they are aligned to the right side of this Flex container. But flex end, notice it's flex end, it's not flex right or align right, because the main axis direction can change. As we've already seen, I could set this to row reverse. And now flex end is actually the left side of the content. The main axis starts here and it moves to the left. Anyway, let's go back to just a regular row. We also have flex start, which aligns the content with the start of the main axis. And then we have some other options, including center, which is very useful. It's going to take that extra space and use it to center our content in the middle. And, I might actually just get rid of some of these boxes for now. Let's go with 4 boxes just to make this easier to illustrate. Okay, so there's my 4 boxes. And there's extra space. It's on the sides, so my content is centered. If we just go back to flex end, they'll be on the right side. We go back to flex start, they'll be on the left side because that is the direction of my main axis, left to right, start to end. So we saw center, but we also have 2 that I'm going to highlight here called space between and space around, and they seem similar. Space between allows us to take whatever additional space there is and jam it evenly between our elements. So in between any 2 elements, but not on the edges. So this is what that would look like. And then if we do space around, it will also add that space around on the edges. So each element has the same amount of space around it. Whatever this is here, let's just make up, let's say it's 30, 40, I don't know, I can't estimate this stuff. Let's say it's 60 pixels, 50 pixels. Oh my God, I'm spending too much time on that. Whatever that number is, it also has that spacing on the side here. And then this element has that same amount there and here. So every element has that same spacing around it. Versus space between, our end elements don't get any space on the left or right in this case. So at this point, hopefully you can already see how useful this can be. If you replace my colored divs here with images or with paragraphs or buttons or links in a nav bar, all of a sudden you can space them with just a single line. Justify content. I can put them in the center of my content. I can distribute space between them, which is one I use a lot, space between. This is pretty useful in my opinion. It doesn't look great here, but it can be. It's really nice. If we didn't have Flexbox, this sort of thing would be very tricky to set up the margins and figure out what percentage or what to put as the margins here on the left. We wouldn't want any, but then here we want margin right. Then we want margin left and right here. It just gets really annoying and very difficult to do. But Flexbox allows us to very easily manipulate that space just using a single or a couple properties. And this is all distributing space along the main axis. So if I change what that main axis is, right now it's left to right. We already saw right to left if we just did row reverse. But if I instead go to a column layout, what is my main axis now? It's top to bottom. So I'm distributing that space top to bottom evenly between my elements. But if I do flex end, where will they be aligned to? Flex dash end. Oh my goodness, there we go. They go to the end of that main axis, top to bottom. And if I did flex start, they'd be aligned to the top. If I do center, they're now aligned vertically center from top to bottom. Now, if I wanted to align them horizontally centered horizontally, that is the cross axis, right? This is the main top to bottom because I'm in a column. Left to right is the cross axis, and that brings me to the next property, align items. I'm interrupting myself with a quick exercise for you. Recreate this layout that you see here with the same 4 boxes. We don't need all of them involved. So 1, 2, 3, 4. How do you get this exact layout? So the width is still 300 pixels. You don't need to change that. But notice where they are in the middle of this box and also the order they're in. And here's the solution. All that you need to do is set flex direction to row reverse. That part's very important because we're going 1, 2, 3, 4, right to left for that main axis. We don't need flexwrap set to wrap. We're not actually wrapping at this point. And then justify content needs to be set to center in order to center our content. Align items defines how space is distributed between items in the flex container along the cross axis. Very similar to justify content, but justify content is for the main axis. Align items is for the cross axis. So we can do flex start, which is going to be the default. If I set this to flex start, align items flex dash start, the cross axis goes from left to right, so they're already aligned to the start. But if I do flex end, now they're going to move all the way to the right side because that's my cross axis end point. And now if I set it to be center, hey, there we go. We've got horizontally and vertically aligned content thanks to justify content. That's our main axis, top to bottom. We want it to be centered. And then cross axis is what align items controls, left to right, centered as well. Now if I change this back to a row, flex direction row, things change a little bit, but we're still centered horizontally and vertically. But let's go back. Let's do, instead of center here, let's do space between. Okay. And then we can decide what we want for align items. I'm going to set it back to, how about flex end before I finish typing? Where will flex end be? What will that look like? There we go. They align to the end of the cross axis, which is top to bottom. I could change that with wrap reverse. Now all of a sudden the cross axis is bottom to top. I know it's a little bit overwhelming having to see all of those. Let's do flex start. And let's see what happens if I leave this off entirely. What are they doing here? Well, the default value in this case is something called stretch. For align items, the content is going to stretch to fit that cross axis. So if I go back and I set align items to be stretch, nothing changes. But if I instead set it to center, our items align in the center, and they don't take up as much space as possible. If we set it to be stretch, they grow to fill the entire container along that cross axis. But if I set it to flex end, flex starts, we've already seen what happens. Now, what about if they have different sizes? So why don't I pick one of these? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll give box 1 a font size of, how about 1.3 ems. And then let's do, I don't know, I'll just quickly do this here. How about 3.4, 2.3, and 6.3 ems. Okay, now they have different sizes. That height is just set based off of the content sizing. And I'm not setting it explicitly. Of course, if I did give each box a height, if I set height to be, I don't know, 400 pixels, then they're all just going to look exactly the same. But let's not have that. Let's give them a different height. And now, if I set them to be align items of stretch, they still will take up the exact same amount of space in this flex container. If I set them to be centered, they will be centered along that vertical axis, or in this case it's vertical, but they're technically along the cross axis, which could be horizontal. It could be right to left to right, top to bottom to top. it's not set in stone. That's the whole point of Flexbox, and that's why the terminology is a bit wonky, is that nothing is necessarily vertical or horizontal. It could change in the blink of an eye based off of flex direction and flexwrap. So we have this other option, which is baseline, and baseline is going to align elements based off of the baseline for their text. I don't know what the exact terminology is, but let me just set it up for you. Baseline. And why don't I smush these guys together? How would I do that? How would I get them to align in the center here with space on the left and the right horizontally? I would need to change justify content. I'll just make it center. Okay, so if I set align items back to center, you'll see that they are aligned horizontally and vertically in the center. But if I go back to baseline, now they're aligned based off of the baseline of the text. So it is different. This can be very useful if you have text of different sizes or elements that have text inside of them, like headings or buttons or something, and you want them to be aligned even if their size is different. You want them to start at the same place. All right, it's time for yet another exercise, very quick one with this same file or the same code pen. I'd like you to recreate this. So you'll need to uncomment what we have 4 of them, the other 5 boxes. Notice, just look at what I have and create that using the properties that we've just covered. So justify content, align items if needed, flex direction, flex wrap, that sort of thing. Alrighty, so here is my solution. Scroll down. Well, actually before that, notice we have a column layout, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, but it is wrapping in the reverse direction. So the main axis goes this way, top to bottom, but the cross axis goes right to left. So we need to set that cross axis with wrap reverse. Flex direction is column. And then justify content is space between. So that's along the main axis this way. Space between, as you can see more clearly on this side, the extra space on that main axis is evenly distributed between the elements. And then we have align items set to center. Now, you might notice all this extra space between the actual columns. If I get rid of align item center, which direction is this over here? Well, this is the start of our cross axis. It's the same as doing align items flex start. But fortunately, right after this, we're going to cover how we could get rid of this space, or at least use it and figure out how we want to align our columns. Do we want them to be centered together, smushed all the way across the page? There's all these different things we can do. So that's coming up right now. Okay, so now we're going to talk about yet another property, align content. Another thing that I think is very confusing, align items, align content. Which one is which? Align content defines how space is distributed between rows in a flex container, so along the cross axis. So I've gone ahead and added in the remaining boxes that were commented out. I made everything the same size again. And what are we working with? A row that does wrap, where we have justify content set to center. So there is no space between the rows. There's no space to distribute at the moment because the default value for align items is stretch here. So if I look at align items, stretch, nothing is going to change. But if I change that to center, for example, now we have a whole bunch of extra space, and we need to decide how to distribute that space with align content. So one option is flex start, align content, flex start. So remember, this is based off of the cross axis, and the cross axis right now is top to bottom. If I did flex end, it's the end of the cross axis. If I had center, our content will move to the middle there. And if we have space between or space around, you've seen what this does. There's space around, and here is space between. So again, this is the space between the rows. And if I switch this up, actually, what if we did a column here instead? We're dividing up the space between, well, I guess it's a column and a column, or just a row if you tilt your head a little bit. Anyway, it's the space between them. Or if we did center, we're now centering them in the middle. And then what if I wanted everything to be up against the top of this container? Everything pushed up. So remember, this is a column, so the main axis goes from up here, top to bottom, and the property we need to change is justify content for the main axis I could set that to flex start. And there we go. So that is align content. As I've already mentioned, I mix it up with align items a lot. So at this point, we've wrapped up the different container properties: flex direction, justify content, flex wrap, align items, and align content. Now we're going to talk about the flex item properties. These are properties we apply to the individual items that are inside of a flex container. So these all are they're not global, but they are container-wide changes. Now we can manipulate one item at a time. So the first thing we'll see is alignself, and this allows us to override align items on an individual item. So for example, I've got everything in here aligned. Well, I have align items for the container set to flex start, but then I can align this one box using alignself. It's a way to break the mold, I guess. So let's go back to a row, and let's go back to probably 4 of these guys or 5 of them, just easier to look at. And we'll change this back to a row here. We'll wrap, let's justify content, let's do space, sure, space between. Align item center, we don't really need align content right now. Okay, so if I wanted to change box 3 so it's not aligned vertically in the center, I want it to be aligned at the top. I need to find box 3, which is right here, and I'll just open this up here. Align self, and then we have the same properties, flex end, flex start. So this is based off of the cross axis, right? Main axis for a row, cross up and down, well, up to down. So start is up here, flex end would be to align it to the bottom. So this is how you can move one item at a time, or align one item at a time. We've got flex start, we have stretch, if I wanted to make that take up the entire available space. There we go. And that's kind of it for align self. So moving on here, at this point, all of our layouts, all of our items have been equally sized, although we could change the sizing of things manually. I could give each one a different width, but we're not doing any flexboxy stuff to resize elements to make them take up available space. For example, if I wanted the middle orange box to grow or the side left and right boxes to shrink down, how do we accomplish this? How do we accomplish that? Well, we need to use a property called flex, or we can use a property called flex. It's actually shorthand for 3 different properties, and those 3 properties are flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. So we're going to begin with flex basis. This one is kind of like width, but it's actually not the same thing. I'll show you some differences. But what we're doing with flex basis is specifying the ideal starting size of some flex item before it's placed into a flex container. So with these boxes here, if I get rid of, let's get rid of align self on that one item. Okay, so right now I have hard-coded a width of 300 pixels in, but if I get rid of that, okay, so that is our element size just based off of the content in each one of these divs. But if I decide I would like each one to ideally be 300 pixels, which is what we had before, or maybe 200 pixels, I can use flex basis and set that to be 200 px. Or I could use a percentage. So if I wanted them to take up 25%, there's 4 of them, I'll do 25%, and then we shouldn't have any leftover space. So that is the basic idea of flex basis, but I could also set something like, what if I have 50% and I turn off wrapping? So we don't wrap. Well, what happens now? You can see what happens there. They're still smushed down to fit inside of that one row. So flex basis is the initial ideal size. We'd like for each one to be 50% of the container, but if we can't wrap or if there's too many elements, then they're going to have to shrink. And we'll learn how to control the shrinkage. We'll learn how to decide which elements shrink and which ones don't. But let's talk about the difference between flex basis and width. This is an important thing that I see come up pretty commonly when I'm teaching this. So let's go back to 25%. We're saying each one of these items should be 25% along the main axis. We're not saying 25% wide or width. When we're in a row, yes, that is width. But if I were to suddenly make this a column, so column right here, now our elements have a height of 25%. So that is very different. I'll just keep that there. And then if I make this a width of 300 pixels, or how about just a width of 25%, that's very, very different. When we're in a row, it's exactly the same. We're controlling the width with flex basis. But in a column, flex basis is controlling the size along the main axis, whichever direction that may be. So it is different than width. Also, if you do have both of them set, for example, if I go back to a row layout, and I set flex basis to be 25% and I have width of 10%, you'll see that flex basis wins out. Even though width is coming afterwards, we're in a flex container, flex basis has higher priority. So we can use height in a row. If we want to control the height, we would use height. There's not a flex property for that. So I could say height is actually 100%, or height is 50%. And another exercise with this code pen, I'd like for you to recreate this layout that you can see here. So I've got all 9 boxes involved. And notice that we have sort of an alternating pattern. We have one box that goes 50% or halfway across, and another box that takes up half the real estate. But then the next box goes all the way across. And then we have 50-50, and then all the way across 50-50. It's kind of hard to see the two blues there. And then 100% all the way across. So you'll need to use the properties we've covered. I'm not setting width explicitly on this. Also, you'll need to figure out a way. I wouldn't call out each one of these boxes, like 3, 6, and 9 individually. You should be able to style every third box the same way. So there's a selector you can use to select every third element with a class name of box. And here's a solution. It looks like this. I gave every box a flex basis of 50%. So that's where these guys get their flex basis from. And then I selected every third with nth of type 3n, and I gave them a flex basis of 100%. And now they go all the way across. So this is kind of silly with these colored boxes, but this is really similar to what we saw with one of the blog layouts at the very beginning of the video. Alrighty, so that's flex basis. That is the first piece to controlling our content. I'm going to go back to a row. But as we've already discussed, if we have a flex basis that is too large or our content does not fit, if I have 50%, or the other way around, if I set flex basis to be 10% and I have a whole bunch of extra space, how do I get elements to grow and take up that space? So that's where this property flex grow and flex shrink come in. So flex grow dictates how any unused space should be spread amongst individual flex items. So it's something we can apply to one item at a time. And unlike flex basis where we use an actual length, pixels or a percentage or some measurement, with flex grow, it's all about ratios. So we can make each box share space evenly if I set flex grow to 1 for every single element. Or I could set flex grow to be 20 on every box, and there won't be any difference at all. So if I do that here, flex grow, how about 40? They all will grow to be the same size, just as if I had flex grow 4, flex grow 1. This is just the ratio, and they're all going to have the exact same value, so it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the number is. Usually I would just put 1, but we're indicating that among all these boxes, 1, 2, 3, 4, if there's leftover space, which there is, each element should get an equal share of that leftover space. But if I instead allocate to box 3, I say flex grow is actually 2. Now it gets twice the amount of extra space. That doesn't mean it's twice the size, or it doesn't necessarily mean that it could be. Instead, we're saying that it gobbles up twice the amount of leftover space. So if I set flex grow to 4, you can see what we end up with. Why don't I do something like this? I'll do flex grow of 1 up here, so it gets some extra space. Flex grow of 2 here, and then flex grow of 3 here, and then on box 4, we'll keep it at 4. So again, we're not ending up with, this one, 2, being half the size necessarily of this box here. It's all about how much extra space we have left. Now, my flex basis is set to 10%, but if I hard-coded this to be, how about 10 pixels? Now, we can see what happens. We end up with a lot more space being allocated to this guy, and then just a little bit of space being allocated here. But if I set flex basis to be 300 pixels, there's not a lot of leftover space to allocate, but more of it goes to this element than goes to this one here. So it's all about ratios. If I just go back to what we had before, get rid of some of these, I've got flex grow of 1 for all boxes except this guy has flex grow of 2. But I could change that to be flex grow of 4 and flex grow of 8, and it will look exactly the same. It's just the ratio. Okay, so once again, let's do something like 10 pixels as the flex basis. Very, very tiny. And if I set flex grow to be any number, if it's all the same, all of these elements will grow to share that space. So if you don't want that to happen, then don't add flex grow. So next up, we have the counterpart, which is flex shrink. This dictates how items should shrink when there is not enough space in the container. They can't all fit in there. How should things shrink down? So let's set things, how about flex basis to be 50%? And obviously at 50%, we can't have 4 elements going across, so there's multiple rows. But if we get rid of that and I say flex wrap is not wrap, I'm just going to comment it out, well, they all shrink down to fit there. And that's the default behavior. They're all going to shrink down the same way. So if I set flex shrink to be 1, nothing changes. If I set it to 10, nothing changes. They all shrink in the same way. It's the same ratio. I'll shrink as much as you shrink, as much as you shrink, as much as you shrink. But if I pick one of them, how about box 1 here, and I give it a different flex shrink value, like 10, it's going to shrink a lot more. So whatever the amount of space is that we're overflowing, 10 times more of the space is going to be removed from this guy than from other boxes. At least that's how it should work, right? If I say 100 times more, we're still bound by the size of my content here. So it's not going to make this like 1 pixel wide and minuscule. It would, I guess, if there was no content in there. But generally, we're not going to do something like 1 to 100. But just like with FlexGrow, it's all about ratios. So those 3 properties are super useful. And as I've already talked about, there's the flex shorthand property. I just want to quickly talk about how it works. If you pass 3 values in, the first one will be grow, the second one is flex shrink, and then flex basis will be the third. But if you just pass 1 in, if it's a unitless number like 2 or 5 or 7, it's going to be flex grow. If you pass in a number with units, some sort of length like in ems or percentages or pixels, that will be considered flex basis. And if you pass in 2 values, unitless, it will be flex grow, then flex shrink. If one of them has a unit, that will be flex basis. You get the idea. So just to demo that, if I set, how about flex basis on all of them to be 10%? Sure. And then I want to set all of them to flex grow. I want them to take up the same amount of empty space, except for this second one, or maybe the third one, since I've already indented this here. I could just use flex, the shorthand, and set that to some number. That will be flex grow. And then I can call one out here with flex of 2. And there we go. That is flex grow. If I passed in another number here, like how about 100%, that would be the flex basis. And you can see that it takes up a lot more space, although it's still not 100%, of course. It doesn't go all the way across, but it gets higher priority to take up as much space as it can, and then whatever is left over, these guys still have to take up a minimum amount of space because of their content. That can't be erased or ignored. So this thing is not 100%, but it gets priority. Anyway, that's the basic idea of flex, flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. 3 standalone properties, 1 shorthand property. Next up, we'll take a look at kind of a fun one, which is order. Order is another property we apply to the individual flex items, and it allows us to reorder elements in their flex container. And this might seem sort of silly. Why would you need to reorder something? Why bother? Can't you just change the order in your markup? The answer, of course, is yes, you could just change the order. But sometimes you want dynamic orders, especially with responsive layouts. So here's something that we'll be building in just a moment. It's very simple. I've got a nav bar, a footer, and then I've got 3 pieces of content, a left sidebar, a right sidebar, and a main article. So imagine there's actually content in here. And I've got this left sidebar on the left side, but it's actually not first in my markup. And that's deliberate. I don't want the sidebar to be the first thing in the markup. If you look at it over here, we actually have the article first, so that people who are using screen readers or even other code that is reading my application or reading my website's content, is going to encounter the article first. This is the most important thing. I don't want it to be buried beneath a sidebar that probably has like hundreds, well, maybe dozens of links and a bunch of nasty, ugly markup in there that's hard to comprehend. I want the main stuff to be up front. I want it to be the first thing that you encounter if you're navigating without a mouse. You're using the keyboard, you're hitting tab or something, or you're using a screen reader. This should come first. So that's one reason. Just making things more accessible, prioritizing our content, but being able to reorder it using CSS without actually changing the order in the markup. But this is also responsive, and as I shrink this down, you'll see the order changes. So if I scale this down, like we were on a mobile phone, you'll see that the order changes once again. First of all, this goes to a column. We'll see how to do that. But then we have the article up front. If you're on an iPhone or a mobile device, you may not want to have a large sidebar first. You might just want the nav bar and then the main article. So those are two reasons why order can be useful. We're never changing the order of our markup, but we are reordering the visual display, the visual order of the flex items. So how does it work? Well, it's just a property that accepts a number. Oh, I forgot a semicolon here. So we pass in a number like order 2. So I'm assigning box 1, which is this box here, order of 2. What's going to happen? What? According to the slides, which you'll have to trust, it ends up at the very end. Shouldn't it just be the second item? Well, the way that order works is the default value is 0 for everything, every flex item. So if I selected box 3 and I gave it an order of -1, it would move to the front. So you can pick whatever order you want, whatever number you want. You could give everything an order of 20 and then give one element an order of 19, and 19 will be first. So if we go back to this example, I'll get rid of the flex stuff, the sizing. I'll just get flex bases back to, 10%, and I'll just set flex to 1. So everything shares the space evenly. Alrighty, so if I wanted to put, how about 3 up front? I wanted 3 to come first. I can't just select box 3 and give it an order of 1, as we've already seen. It's going to move to the end because these guys have an order of of 0. But I could say order of -1, and now it will move to the front. Or I could keep it at order of 1 and then give every other box, every other item or box a order of 2. And now we get 3, 1, 2, 4. So I can use whatever numbers I want. Maybe there's an upper limit or a lower limit. Generally, though, you're not reordering tons and tons of stuff. It's just a couple things maybe that you want to move around. So 1, 2, 3, 4, that sort of thing is what I use. But the default is 0. So now let's play around with creating this example where we have our content in a different order. Main article, left sidebar, right sidebar. But then it's showing up left, main, right. And this main section is taking up more space. So here's what we're going to begin with. We have our markup over here. I've got my styles. There's no flexbox involved. Each one of these is just a header or an article or an aside or a footer. They're block level elements. They go all the way across the screen. So as I've already shown you, I want the 3 middle elements to be in one line in a row. So I'm going to put them in a flex container, put them in a flex box. And they're already inside of a main element. I've got a header, a main, and a footer. So I'm going to select my main. I'll just do this all, where should I do that? Maybe here. And make it a flex box. So display flex. Okay, and the default direction is a row, which is fine. Now what I want to do, let's start with the order, is make it so that my main article is actually in the middle. I want the left sidebar to come first visually without changing the content here. So my main is first. The main article content is the first thing you encounter, but visually, I want it to be the second thing. So I can select, I have sidebar left and sidebar right, and then I have the article item, which is this here. I can give them an order. So I'll give sidebar left an order of 1. And then the sidebar right will have an order of 3. And then I can give this article item, which is right there, the purple thing, an order of 2. And there we go. Now I just need to make them take up more space. So I'm going to give them all a flex grow or just a flex of 1 to begin with. So we'll do flex of 1 here. It's going to get really big. And I could just leave it at that if I'm happy with that width. Or I could do flex of 1 for these guys, this left and right sidebar, flex of 1. and then give the middle main article maybe a flex of 3 or something, and have it take up more space. I think that looks a little better. So that's the use case for order. If I shrink this down though, things get a little bit cramped. And what I'd like to do is actually change it so that it goes to a column layout on a smaller screen size. Now, if you're following along with my Colt's Code Camp, we have not talked about breakpoints and media queries. That will be a video topic I need to release shortly. But for now, we already know what we need to do. We need to make it a column instead of a row-based Flexbox. So I could just start with that, which is not what we want to do, but I could select my main and say flex direction is column, just like that. And now when we shrink down, that's exactly what we want, but it's just not what we want on a large screen size. So in order to add that logic so that it switches between column and row, I'm going to add in this media query that says for a size between 0 pixels and 575 pixels, basically for mobile screen sizes, I want something to happen. I want on my main element, that's the flex container, this thing here that we just played around with, I want its flex direction to change. I want flex direction to be column. And that's it. So I'll shrink this down. We're in a row layout, flex direction row, but then we get to mobile. Now we go to columns. Now I could also change the order as I showed you. I may not want the sidebar to be right after the nav bar. If this is a mobile layout, often we might want to just hide it entirely or just have it after the main article. So I'm just going to change the order here just to show you that. Let's take the order of the left sidebar, which right now is 1, and let's just make it 2 or 3. So left sidebar, or sidebar left, on a mobile size, order will be 2. So nothing changes, but then when we shrink down, now we have main article first, and then left, and then right. So we go back to what we had before, basically, in the markup, versus when we go back to our row layout, a non-mobile screen size, the order changes. We have left, main, right. Alrighty, so at this point we've covered all of these properties that you can see in front of you. We've got the container properties on the left, flex direction, justify content, flexwrap, align items, align content. We spent all that time talking about the main axis, the cross axis, and then we talked about a couple different flex item properties that we apply to individual items, order, flex, which is the shorthand for flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis, which for some reason is missing from this diagram, and we also saw align self. Hopefully you can see the utility in Flexbox. Yes, there's a lot of terminology, there's a lot of properties to keep track of, but it's also very powerful. So if you'd like, I have another relatively quick exercise. I'd like you to take this starter code, which you can find a link to in the description, take this initial code pen and turn it into this right here. So I've given you all of the styles in terms of the fonts, the background color, there's a little box shadow, there's a hover effect, but the layout is not great. So we use Flexbox to create this nav bar, and we also use Flexbox to center this content here, right in the middle, vertically and horizontally. But I'll tell you right now, if you do want to attempt this, we actually have nested Flexboxes or flex containers. This nav bar is going to become a flex container. But then actually, if you look at each item in there, this is an anchor tag. It's just a link. Notice that the content is centered both horizontally and vertically. So I'm using nested flexes, nested flex boxes. Also, I just have this class called active, and whatever link I apply that to, that style is already made for you, but it just gives it that blue border on the bottom, so you don't need to worry about that. Okay, so give it a shot if you'd like, and I'll go ahead and implement it. Here we go. So let's start with the easier part, which is the main. To center this content horizontally and vertically, we have this main element, and I've already given the main a height. This is a little bit tricky. It's not that tricky, but if you're following my course on YouTube, we haven't talked about calc. Basically, I set this navbar to be 80 pixels tall, and I want this gray background, the main, to be 100% of the view height minus 80 pixels tall. There are other ways of doing this, but that's just one of the shortest ways. Okay, so I'm going to now select that main and make it a flex box. Display flex. Okay, so now our content, an H1 and an H2, they're in a row. So how do I make that not a row? we'll set flex direction to be column. And there we go. And then I want to align them. Well, let's start actually with justify content. I want them to be centered, justify content center. And then I want them to be centered horizontally, which is the cross axis. So I need align items center. And now that part is pretty much done. Now let's talk about the nav bar. So this nav bar already exists as a nav element. I probably should have given it an ID or a class or something. Here's the nav. I've already written some styles. And what we need to do now is turn it into a flex box. So display flex. So that doesn't appear to make a huge difference because there's all this empty space. So how do we get these elements to grow, to take up that empty space? Well, we could set flex grow on the individual items, not the container, but each item. So that's the anchor tags inside of the nav. So I could set flex grow to be 1 or just the shorthand flex 1. Now they grow, and that looks okay. But now we have the problem that the content inside each anchor tag is aligned to the top left. There's a little bit of padding there, but it's the top left. It's not centered. And I could just do center text, so text align. I don't know why I'm typing center there. Text align center. But we still want it to be aligned vertically as well. And, I could add padding or margin to make that happen. But if I want this to be responsive, whatever the height is of the nav bar, I want the individual links to be centered vertically and horizontally. I'm not going to hard code in a percentage or a number of pixels or something. Instead, I'm actually going to make each anchor tag a flexbox, display flex. And then I'm going to set justify content to be center. So that should center us. And then I'm going to set align items for the cross axis to also be center. And there we go. So we have one flexbox here for the entire nav bar, and then each link is actually its own flex container. And then we have our main content here. There's not a lot to see, but that is also a flex container. This one is set in a column. So the main axis goes from top to bottom, justify content center, align item center. So there's another example. If you're still struggling to see the utility of Flexbox, I definitely recommend that you try and recreate this yourself without it. Center these links horizontally and vertically, space them out evenly in this nav bar, center this horizontally and vertically, and make it work on any size. It's doable, but it's kind of a pain. Also, with just a little tiny bit of code, by setting flex direction to column on a small screen size, I can make this a somewhat responsive nav bar. It doesn't look great, obviously, because of the way this border is set up. You probably wouldn't want this to display like this, but this is something you could do on a mobile device. We would probably get rid of that, or maybe we would add an element inside for the text, like a span, and we could add a border to that span rather than the entire anchor tag. But anyway, just a tiny little change. You can totally reconfigure that nav bar, but I'm going to get rid of that. That wasn't part of the exercise. Okay. So that's it for now. We've covered a lot. It's been a pretty long video. I hope you're still with me. I hope you're still conscious. Flexbox is incredibly useful, a little bit overwhelming with all those properties. Don't feel bad about referencing them or trying align items and then realizing, oh, it's actually align content, or even mixing up align items and justify content. I still do that probably every other time I try and use Flexbox, and then I manage to remember it for 5 or 6 hours, and then it just disappears. It's a memory of a goldfish. Anyway, very useful stuff. Layout without Flexbox can be a huge, huge nuisance. Now, Flexbox is not the only system or the only tool for laying out your web pages with CSS. There's also the CSS grid system, which I'll be doing a separate video on. Anyway, I'm going to go away. I'm going to go curl up into a ball and take a nap for 7 years. This video has been quite the undertaking, so I hope you enjoyed it. Please consider liking it, subscribing, commenting, all of that stuff, sharing. Definitely sharing if you don't mind. Hope you're all doing well, staying safe and sane, and I will see you later this week. All right, bye everyone.